The land stretched out like a faded painting, its colors dulled by winter's grip. Dry grass bent under a biting wind that swept in from the north, carrying the faint rattle of frozen branches and the distant mournful call of a lone crow. The edge of this weary landscape stood the Mayfield homestead, 2 rooms of rough timber and a leaning porch that creaked in protest whenever the wind howled too hard. Smoke drifted lazily from the chimney, curling up against a sky the color of tarnished silver. Inside, Clara Mayfield moved like a shadow, her every step measured, quiet, as if afraid that even the sound of her own feet might stir the beast that slept under her roof. She was only 26, but life had worn her face into something older, something tired. Her hair, once honey gold, was tied back in a loose braid, stray strands catching the pale morning light that seeped through the small kitchen window. The bruise along her cheekbone was already turning from angry red to a deep purple, a mark she hadn't bothered to hide because there was no one in the world here to hide it from. Her 3 daughters were at the table, Lydia, 8 years old, and quiet as a church mouse, carefully buttering a slice of stale bread. Rose, just 5, swinging her legs beneath her chair as if trying to pretend this was any other morning. And baby Emily, still in her nightgown, a smear of porridge on her chin. Clara's eyes lingered on them with that tender, aching love that only a mother can carry, the kind that bends and stretches under the weight of hardship but never, ever breaks. Ezekiel Mayfield, her husband, was still in bed, though sleeping wasn't the right word. He had come in late, reeking of whiskey, his boots leaving mud across the floorboards. Clara had tried to keep the girls quiet, ushering them into bed before he stumbled through the door, but it hadn't mattered. He'd wanted to talk, no, to accuse. His voice had been sharp as a whip, slashing into her for all the things she couldn't change, for the fact that she had given him 3 girls instead of the sons he claimed he needed. And when her quiet answer hadn't satisfied him, his hand had struck her cheek with the weight of years of disappointment. Now, in the cold light of morning, Clara kept her movements deliberate. She placed more porridge into the pot on the stove, stirring slowly so the wooden spoon didn't scrape too loud. She had learned to read the house like a weathered map. Every creak in the floorboards, every groan of the walls told her where the dangers lay. Lydia glanced up at her mother's face, eyes clouded with the kind of understanding no child should have. Clara gave her a small smile, hoping it might be enough to reassure her, even if it was a lie. Outside, the wind tugged at the laundry line, the faded shirts and dresses snapping like tired flags. Clara stepped out with a basket of damp clothes, the cold biting her hands as she pinned them to the rope. She drew in the crisp air, letting it sting her lungs, because for a brief moment out here, away from the walls that trapped her, she could almost imagine she was free, almost. But the truth pressed against her ribs. Freedom was a faraway dream, and reality was a house where kindness had long since died. As she worked, her mind flickered to the days when she'd first come here, young and believing Ezekiel's promises of building a good life together. She'd imagined fields of green, a strong home, and laughter in the air. Instead, she had watched the crops fail year after year, had felt hope drain like water through her fingers, and had endured the slow transformation of the man she'd married into someone cruel and bitter. She had no brothers nearby, no father. To run to her family was 2 states away, and letters were a luxury they could not afford. Her entire world was this stretch of dry land and the 3 little faces that looked to her for safety she could barely give. The door banged open behind her, and Clara flinched, the wooden clothespin slipping from her fingers. Ezekiel's boots thudded on the porch as he stepped out, squinting into the morning glare. His shirt was half-buttoned, his hair sticking up in unruly tufts, and his eyes held that hard glint she had come to dread. He muttered something about needing to ride into town later, about the hay he'd promised to sell to someone. Clara kept her gaze on the fluttering laundry, answering with a soft yes, that was neither agreement nor defiance, just a sound. To keep the peace. He lingered a moment longer, looking her up and down, and then went back inside, the door slamming shut with a force that made the laundry line sway. Clara stood there for a long moment, her breath clouding in the cold air, the clothespin still in her hand. In her chest her heart beat a steady rhythm, not of hope, but of endurance. She thought of her daughters inside, of the bruise blooming on her cheek, of the long winter ahead. She had no reason to believe anything would change. And yet, a part of her, buried deep beneath the layers of weariness, still whispered that life couldn't go on like this forever. Something would have to give. She just didn't know when or how it would come. The wind had shifted by mid-morning, bringing with it a sharper edge that hinted at snow. Clara had finished hanging the last of the laundry, her fingers numb and red from the cold, when she heard the faint rhythm of hooves carrying across the pido. Open land. At first, she thought it might be Ezekiel returning from town earlier than expected, though it was far too soon for that. She glanced toward the horizon and saw a lone rider approaching, his figure growing clearer with each slow, deliberate stride of his horse. Something in the way he sat in the saddle upright, steady spoke of quiet strength, the kind that didn't need to announce itself. Her heart beat a little faster, not with excitement, but with the cautious instinct of a woman who had learned to weigh every visitor's presence. Strangers were rare out here, and rarer still were ones who came alone. She wiped her hands on her apron and straightened, though she stayed close to the porch steps, unwilling to wander too far from the door in case she needed to retreat. The man rode a deep chestnut gelding, its coat sleek despite the chill. His hat was pulled low over his brow, shadowing his eyes, but as he drew closer, she could make out the strong lines of his face, weathered by sun and wind. His coat was worn but well kept, the leather of his gloves darkened by years of work. He reined in his horse a few yards from her, his gaze sweeping briefly over the yard, the sagging fence, the small figures of Lydia and Rose watching from the window, and finally landing on Clara. "Mornin', ma'am," he said, his voice low and steady, carrying over the wind without strain. Clara inclined her head in a polite nod, her fingers curling into the fabric of her apron. "Morning." He introduced himself as Jonas Hawley, said he'd come to speak with Ezekiel about the hay Ezekiel had promised to sell him before winter tightened its grip. His words were straightforward, businesslike, but his eyes lingered on her face a fraction too long, catching the discoloration along her cheek. Clara felt heat rise in her neck, not from shame, though she'd been made to feel it often enough, but from the uncomfortable knowledge that someone else could see the truth of her life without her speaking it aloud. She told him Ezekiel was inside, likely still asleep, and moved to step aside so he could dismount. But Jonas stayed in the saddle for a moment longer, his gaze shifting toward the window where the girls peered out. Lydia ducked back quickly, but Rose's wide eyes stayed fixed on him, unblinking. He gave a small, almost imperceptible nod in their direction before swinging down from his horse. The door creaked open then, and Ezekiel appeared, his hair still mussed, his shirt hanging open at the collar. His eyes narrowed when he saw Jonas. "You're early," he muttered, stepping out onto the porch. Jonas didn't flinch under the sour tone. "Weather's turning. Figured I'd get the hay before snow makes the trail worse." Ezekiel grunted, glancing briefly at Clara as if daring her to speak. She stayed silent, her eyes on the ground, letting the men talk. But she didn't have to look up to feel Jonas noticing the tension between them, the way Ezekiel stood too close, the way Clara's shoulders tightened ever so slightly when her husband moved. When the deal for the hay was discussed and the payment exchanged, Ezekiel made a cutting remark about Clara being slow with chores, and how a man can't get much help when all he's got are womenfolk. His words were sharp, aimed to wound. and Clara could feel them pierce through the quiet she tried to wrap around herself. Jonah's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. He didn't rise to the bait, didn't challenge Ezekiel outright, but there was a flicker in his eyes, something like disapproval, maybe even anger, that passed quickly before his expression settled back into calm. He tipped his hat toward Clara as he mounted his horse again, saying only, "Ma'am," before riding out at a steady pace. Clara watched him go until he was little more than a dark figure against the pale expanse of land. She didn't know why his presence lingered in her thoughts that afternoon, why the memory of his steady voice and unflinching eyes kept returning as she mended Rose's dress and rocked Emily to sleep. Perhaps it was because he'd really seen her in a way most folks didn't bother to. And though he'd said little, the weight of that quiet understanding was something she carried with her into the long, cold evening that followed. The wind picked up after nightfall, rattling the loose boards on the side of the house and whistling through the gaps in the shutters. Inside, the Mayfield home was dim, lit only by the faint glow of a single oil lamp on the table. Clara sat beside the fire, mending one of Lydia's stockings, her stitches slow and careful, though her hands trembled from more than the cold. The girls were huddled together on a thin mattress in the corner, wrapped in quilts, whispering to each other in soft voices meant not to carry. It had been quiet since supper, too quiet. Ezekiel had barely spoken a word, drinking heavily at the table before retreating outside for a long stretch of time. Clara didn't know where he'd gone, but she knew from experience that the longer he stayed away, the more dangerous his return could be. When the door finally burst open, the icy wind swept in with him, scattering ash from the hearth. His boots thudded hard against the floor as he stomped inside, slamming the door so violently that the oil lamp flickered. His face was flushed from drink, his eyes sharp and unfocused all at once. He looked first at Clara, then at the girls, his lip curling as if the sight of them offended him. "You been sitting there all night while I'm out working?" He slurred, though his ride into town had been for anything but work. Clara kept her gaze on her sewing, the needle slipping through the fabric in silent defiance. "I've been here with the children," she said softly, careful not to meet his eyes. She had learned long ago that challenging him, even with her tone, was a dangerous gamble. But tonight, the whiskey in his blood turned even her quiet answer into a spark to dry kindling. He stepped toward her, the air around him thick with the smell of alcohol and wood smoke. "Children," he spat, "3 of them and not a boy in the bunch. Worthless for the ranch, just mouths to feed. And you," his hand lashed out so suddenly that Clara barely had time to flinch before his palm struck her cheek, the sound sharp in the small room. The girls cried out. Lydia scrambled off the mattress, running to her mother's side, while Rose clutched Emily tighter, rocking her as the baby wailed. Clara's hand rose instinctively to her face. Her breath caught in her throat, but she stayed standing, refusing to give him the satisfaction of seeing her cower. Ezekiel's anger wasn't sated. "I'll not have you thinking you can talk." "Back to me," he growled, stepping closer. Clara took a small step back, her body shielding Lydia from him. But his hand shot out again, gripping her wrist so hard she felt the bones grind. "You think you can run this house better? You think you're worth more than what I tell you?" Something inside Clara cracked, then not a physical bone, but a thread in her spirit pulled so tight it finally snapped. She yanked her wrist from his grasp and without a word reached for the girls. "Come on," she said, her voice trembling but firm. She pulled Lydia toward the door, motioning for Rose to follow with Emily in her arms. They had only made it as far as the porch when Ezekiel's voice roared behind them. "Where the hell do you think you're going?" He stormed after them, his boots pounding against the floorboards. Clara's breath came fast, the freezing wind biting at her skin as she tried to make it down the steps, the girls stumbling beside her. She aimed for the barn, thinking only of getting them out of the house, of finding some small pocket of safety until the storm of his rage passed. But he caught up before they could reach it, his hand tangling in her braid and yanking her backward. Clara cried out, nearly losing her footing. Lydia tried to help her mother, but Ezekiel shoved the child aside, sending her sprawling into the snow. "You'll learn your place," he snarled. Dragging Clara toward the barn door. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of hay and horse, warmer than outside but still biting in the corners. He shoved her against a wooden post, his shadow looming over her in the dim light. "You think you can take my children from me?" he hissed. "You think you can walk out?" His hand raised again, this time in a fist. And then before it could fall, another voice cut through the space, low and steady, carrying a weight that stopped Ezekiel mid-motion. "That's enough." Both turned toward the doorway. There, framed by the wind and the darkness beyond, stood Jonas Hawley. He had one hand resting lightly on the barn door, the other hanging at his side, though there was a tension in his stance that suggested he could move in an instant if he had to. His eyes were locked on Ezekiel, steady and unyielding, the kind of gaze that made a man reconsider his next breath. Clara's chest rose and fell in quick bursts. Her braid still tangled from the pull, her daughters gathered in a trembling huddle behind a stack of hay. She didn't know how Jonas had come to be here, didn't care in that moment. All she knew was that his presence felt like the first solid ground she'd stood on in years. Ezekiel bristled, his grip on her arm tightening. As he barked, "This ain't your concern, Hawley." Jonas took a slow step inside, the door swinging shut behind him. "It is now." The air inside the barn felt charged, as if the very walls were holding their breath. Jonas stood just far enough inside for the lamplight to catch the sharp angles of his face, the dust of the trail still clinging to his coat and boots. His presence was like the deep stillness before a storm calm, but with a weight that warned of power underneath. Ezekiel's jaw tightened, his shoulders squaring in an attempt to make himself seem larger, but his grip on Clara faltered ever so slightly under Jonas's unflinching stare. "Step away from her," Jonas said, his voice even low, but carrying. A command that didn't need to be shouted to be obeyed. Ezekiel gave a humorless laugh, though it was laced with unease. "She's my wife, my property. You've got no say in what happens in my house, Hawley." Jonas didn't move closer, but something in the way he shifted his stance made the space between them feel smaller. "A man's got a say when he sees." Another man raised a hand to a woman, especially one with children watching. His eyes flicked briefly toward the three little girls trembling near the haystack, then back to Ezekiel. The message was clear. He had seen enough. Ezekiel's face darkened, and he took a half step toward Jonas, his hands curling into fists. "You think you can come in here and tell me how to run my family?" Jonas's voice didn't rise, but the steel in it was unmistakable. "I'm telling you that it stops now." Before Ezekiel could lunge, Jonas closed the distance in 2 long strides. His hand shot out, gripping the front of Ezekiel's shirt and yanking him back from Clara, with a force that made the man stumble. Ezekiel's boots scraped across the barn floor, hay scattering underfoot. He tried to swing a punch, but Jonas caught his arm, twisting it just enough to make him grunt in pain without crossing the line into cruelty. Jonas wasn't here to brawl, he was here to end it. Clara stood frozen, her breath caught somewhere between shock and disbelief. No one had ever stepped between her and Ezekiel before. The girls clung to one another, eyes wide, watching the 2 men in silence broken only by the soft shifting of the horses in their stalls. Jonas shoved Ezekiel back another step, then released him, his posture relaxed but his eyes still locked on him like a man sizing up a rattlesnake. "You've done enough," Jonas said quietly, the words carrying more weight than a shout ever could. Then he turned to Clara, and his voice softened, though it lost none of its certainty. "You're coming with me." The words seemed to hang in the air, heavy with meaning. Clara's lips parted, but no sound came out. She looked at him, then at Ezekiel, still catching his balance, still seething, and then down at her daughters. The bruise on her cheek throbbed with each heartbeat. She thought of the years behind her, the endless days of fear and the nights spent trying to shield the girls from the man who should have protected them. Her mind told her leaving would bring trouble, that there would be consequences. But her heart told her this was the moment she had been waiting for without even knowing it. Ezekiel barked a laugh, though there was an edge of panic to it now. She ain't going anywhere. You hear me, Clara? You take one step. Out with him and you'll regret it. Jonas didn't take his eyes off her as he held out his hand, not in demand, but in an unspoken promise. You can stay here and keep talking what he gives you. Or you can take your girls and leave with me right now. But I'm not a skin twice. The barn was silent except for the sound of the wind outside, rattling the thin boards. Clara's gaze drifted back to her daughters, Lydia's pleading eyes, Rose's trembling chin, little Emily's tiny hands gripping her sister's dress. Something inside her, worn thin but not broken, rose up with quiet resolve. She stepped forward. Jonas moved quickly but gently, guiding her toward his horse. Take Emily, he said, lifting the baby into her arms. Lydia and Rose clung to her skirts, their small hands finding his as he helped them up into the saddle behind her. Once they were settled, he swung up behind them, his arms steady around them all. Ezekiel shouted after them, but Jonas didn't turn his head. He gave the gelding a nudge, and the horse moved into the cold night, hooves striking a steady rhythm against the hard-packed earth. The barn and the shouting faded behind them until all that remained was the whisper of the wind and the sound of the girls breathing. Clara didn't look back. For the first time in years, she wasn't thinking about what Ezekiel might do next. She was thinking about the horizon ahead. The journey to Jonas's ranch took the better part of the night, the moon casting a pale wash over the open plains, turning the frost-silvered grass into a field of quiet stars beneath the horses' hooves. Clara sat in front of Jonas in the saddle, Emily cradled against her chest, while Lydia and Rose leaned against her sides, their little bodies warm despite the cold. The steady, rhythmic motion of the horse was oddly soothing, a contrast to the pounding of her heart that had yet to slow since they left the barn. Jonas said little, but his presence behind her solid, unwavering, was a reassurance she didn't know she could still feel. Every so often she'd glance toward the horizon, half expecting to see Ezekiel's silhouette in the distance, but the land behind them remained empty by the time the first light of dawn brushed the sky. They reached a wide stretch of fenced pasture where a weathered ranch house stood, its dark wood worn but sturdy against the wind. The scent of pine smoke drifted from the chimney, and a pair of horses lifted their heads from the frost-covered grass to watch the newcomers. Jonas dismounted first, lifting Lydia and Rose down gently before reaching for Emily. Clara slid from the saddle on unsteady legs, the sudden stillness making her realize how tightly she'd been gripping the reins of her fear. Jonas didn't rush them inside. Instead, he let the girls look around, letting them see the corral, the neat stack of cut firewood, the barn doors secured against the wind. His movements were deliberate, unhurried, as if to show them this was a place where nothing dangerous lurked in the shadows. "Come on," he said quietly, leading them toward the house. Inside, the warmth of the hearth wrapped around them like a heavy quilt. The smell of coffee and fresh bread lingered in the air, leftovers from an earlier breakfast. Perhaps, but to Clara, it smelled like something more, a home untouched by anger. The furniture was simple but well cared for, a large table at the center of the room, chairs that didn't wobble, shelves lined with jars of preserves. In the corner, a rag rug sat in front of the fireplace, worn but clean, as though it had been tended by careful hands. Jonas showed them to a small bedroom with 2 narrow beds and a crib tucked in the corner. "It's not much," he said, almost apologetic, "but it's yours for as long as you need it." Clara traced her fingers over the quilt on the nearest bed. The fabric was faded but soft, stitched together from scraps in a pattern that spoke of time and care. Lydia ran her hand along the windowsill, peering out at the pasture beyond, while Rose stood near the crib, rocking on her heels as though she didn't know whether to smile or cry. Jonas stepped back toward the doorway. "I'll give you some time to settle in," he said. "You're safe here." The words were simple, but to Clara, they felt like a promise sealed into the walls themselves. The first days were quiet. Jonas went about his work on the ranch mending fences, tending to the horses, chopping wood, while Clara and the girls learned the rhythms of a life without fear. Lydia and Rose began to laugh again, soft at first, then louder, their voices carrying through the rooms in a way that made Clara's chest ache with something that was part grief, part relief. Emily slept more soundly than she had in months, her tiny fists unclenching as if she sensed the absence of tension. Jonas never pried into the details of what had happened before. When Clara burned bread one afternoon because she'd been lost in thought, he didn't snap or scold. He simply fetched another loaf from the pantry and showed her how he kept the fire at a steady heat. When Rose dropped a glass and it shattered across the floor, he crouched down beside her, helping her sweep the pieces without raising his voice. Each moment, small as it was, carved away a layer of the constant vigilance Clara had carried for years. One evening, after the girls had gone to bed, Clara found herself standing at the window, watching Jonas in the yard. He was stacking wood. By the porch, his movements methodical and sure. The lamplight spilled over his shoulders, and for a fleeting moment, she felt something unfamiliar, the stirrings of trust. She didn't know what the future would hold, but for the first time in a long while, the thought of tomorrow didn't fill her with dread. Jonas came in a few minutes later, stamping the cold from his boots. He didn't speak much that night, just poured her a cup of tea before sitting across from her at the table. They shared a quiet that was different from the silences she'd known before. It wasn't the tense stillness before a blow, but the easy pause between two people who didn't need to fill every space with words. Clara took a sip of tea, feeling its warmth spread through her. Somewhere deep inside, a fragile hope began to take root. This was not the life she had known, but perhaps, just perhaps, it could become the life she deserved. Winter deepened across the plains, blanketing the land in white and muffling the sounds of the world until even the wind seemed to move with caution. At Jonas's ranch, the days fell into a steady rhythm: chores in the morning, small comforts in the afternoon, and quiet evenings by the fire. Clara had begun to feel a sense of belonging here, though she didn't name it aloud, afraid that speaking it might somehow break the fragile spell. Lydia and Rose's cheeks had grown rosy from the cold, their laughter more frequent now, carrying across the yard as they played in the snow. Emily had learned to grip Clara's finger with surprising strength. Her baby coo's a sound Clara clung to on nights when her mind wandered back to darker times. Yet, as much as she tried to live in the safety of the present, the past lingered like the shadow of a storm cloud. Sometimes, when she closed her eyes at night, she'd hear the echo of Ezekiel's boots on the porch, the sharp sound of his voice, the slam of a door. The fear wasn't gone, it had simply been pushed to the edges, waiting. Jonas seemed to understand without her having to explain. He never pressed her with questions, never demanded details about what she had endured. But there were moments, fleeting glances, pauses in conversation, when she suspected he was measuring the distance between what she'd escaped and what might still come looking for her. The first sign came on a gray morning when Jonas returned from town with supplies. He set the sack on the table, removed his gloves, and told her, in that steady voice of his, that he'd overheard talk at the feed store. Ezekiel had been asking questions about a woman and 3 little girls, about whether anyone had seen them. Clara's hand tightened on the edge of the table until her knuckles ached. She hadn't expected him to give up so easily, but hearing it confirmed sent a cold wave through her chest. Jonas didn't rush her reaction. He stood nearby, giving her space, as if to say he'd be there whether she needed to speak or simply stand still until her breathing steadied. "He won't get you here," Jonas said finally, his tone leaving no room for doubt. "Not while I've got something to say about it." In the days that followed, Jonas made quiet changes around the ranch. He checked the locks on the doors, reinforced the barn latches, and made sure the girls knew not to wander beyond the fence unless he or Clara was with them. He didn't make a show of it, didn't speak of danger in front of the children, but Clara recognized the preparation. For what it was, a shield being built, plank by plank. One evening, a knock came at the door just after sunset. Clara's heart leapt into her throat before Jonas even rose from his chair. He opened the door to find Sheriff Hart, a tall, wiry man with a lined face, standing on the porch. The sheriff greeted Jonas and then looked to Clara with a gentleness she wasn't used to from lawmen. He said he'd seen Ezekiel in town, that the man had been drinking heavily and muttering about unfinished business. The sheriff made it clear he couldn't hold Ezekiel unless he broke the law, but he wanted Clara to know he was keeping an eye out. After the sheriff left, Jonas closed the door and stood there for a moment, staring into the firelight. "He's getting restless," Jonas said quietly. "But that doesn't change what we do here. We keep living." And so they did. Clara continued tending the small kitchen garden Jonas had helped her start, though the winter frost limited what would send grow. She mended clothes, read to the girls in the evenings, and slowly learned the routines of the ranch. There was a steadiness to the work that made her feel grounded, each completed task a small claim staked in this new life. The fear still came, in waves, but the gaps between them grew longer. Then came the morning Clara woke before dawn and found Jonas already outside, splitting wood. The horizon was a faint ribbon of light, and the air was sharp with cold. She stood at the window for a long time, watching the deliberate rise and fall of the axe, the way Jonas's breath steamed in the chill. Something shifted in her, then not. A sudden transformation, but the quiet acknowledgement that she was no longer living only to avoid pain. She was beginning, in some small way, to live for herself, for her daughters, for the possibility of a future unshackled from fear, that night. After the girls were asleep, she sat across from Jonas at the table. The lamplight made the shadows on his face softer, the lines around his eyes deeper. She told him, in halting words, about the day she decided to leave, about the blow that had knocked her to the ground while Emily cried in her crib. She spoke of the bitter cold of the barn, the metallic taste of blood, the sound of her own heartbeat as she waited for Ezekiel's rage to pass. Jonas listened without interrupting, his hands resting loosely on the table, his gaze steady. When she finished, the silence between them felt heavy but not unbearable. Jonas reached across the table and placed his hand over hers, not gripping, not claiming, just resting there. "You're here now," he said simply, "and you're staying here. I'll see to that." In that moment, Clara realized that while the past might never vanish completely, it didn't have to own her. The future was still unwritten, its shape uncertain, but she was no longer facing it alone. Somewhere beyond the snow-covered plains, Ezekiel might still be searching, his bitterness driving him onward. But here, within these walls, she had found something stronger than fear. She had found a place where her voice could grow again, where her daughters could laugh without looking over their shoulders, where the promise of tomorrow was not a threat, but a hope. And as the fire burned low and the night deepened outside, Clara understood that whatever came next, she was ready to meet it. not because she no longer feared the past, but because she finally believed in the possibility of a different ending.